Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you all had a conflict-free lunchtime. Thanks to Dominic, to Brian, and to GBHI, and all of the teams keeping us running during this exciting first day and a half of Creative Brain Week 2023. I believe that alongside the many innovations in structure and collaboration this year, we've opened a number of important and enriching and challenging strands of both practice and research that I'm sure the speakers that we have over the next hour and a half will continue. My name is Nicholas Johnson, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Drama. I convene the college-wide creative arts practice research theme here at Trinity, and I work as director of research in the School of Creative Arts. In creative arts practice, which is based in the Trinity Long Room Hub, our advanced center for research in the arts and humanities, we sometimes use the slogan, "the freedom to imagine, the power to change," when we describe what we do. We are particularly interested in major social challenges and how the arts, especially interdisciplinary engagement with artists and the arts as a core partner, can intervene in these situations for lasting impact. For just one example of our activities this year, aside from Creative Brain Week, we've engaged substantially recently in the crisis of democracy and around the world with a research project in particular looking at protest art. The first of this strand launched in the Long Room Hub last spring in collaboration with Mandy Lee from the Center of Health Policy and Management in the School of Medicine and with Balaj Apoor, who leads the Center for Resistance Studies. In the building, we curated a several-month-long exhibition of Hong Kongers art created since 2019, which was called We Persist, Therefore We Have Hope. I have been reminded again of the importance, the difficulty, and the promise of this type of work all morning as we've heard from clinicians, neuroscientists, and political scientists' perspectives about the impact of conflict on our brains and to some extent on the brain mechanisms that relate to how conflict develops. So this next hour and a half focuses on what we might call specific artistic interventions in that scene, how different artistic media and technologies and practices, from the ancient to the contemporary, can change dynamics preceding, during, and after a conflict has occurred. We'll hear for the first hour from each speaker in turn. We'll listen to the voices back to back, so they'll speak for about 15 to 20 minutes. You'll hear from each partner and participant, and then we'll break out into more of a roundtable format. All of them will come up here, and we can engage with you, our audience, directly, both in the room and online. So as you listen, you can think about questions and strands and detail that you'd like to pursue, and we'll be very happy to include you in a collaborative discussion. All of us work in the community, and as facilitators and artists, this is our preferred way of engagement. So we're very open to whether it's a comment, a question, a feedback. Please respond the way that you see fit. So I'll introduce each speaker in turn before they speak so you can keep their achievements fresh in your mind as you hear them. These are abbreviated bios, so you can consult the website as well to see their work in context and excavate a little more of the bio and the websites and the organizations they represent. So our first speaker this hour will be Karen Diamond. And Karen is the artistic director of Relive, an arts in health organization co-creating life story arts project with underrepresented communities, including people living with dementia, veterans with complex PTSD, older people, and people at the end of life. So I hand over to the capable hands of Karen.
Prananda. Good afternoon. And hello, people online, wherever you are in the world. Oh, I have to press it, don't I? Yeah, okay. Oh. I've never used one of these before. Is it there? Great. So diolch am y gwahoddiad I Dominic, diolch am y gwahoddiad I siarad heddiw. Fy enw yw Karen Diamond, fel wedodd Nick. My name is Karen Diamond, and thank you for the invitation, Dominic. As Nick said, Relive, the organisation I run, is a life story arts organisation. And we work alongside hidden and underrepresented communities. And our creative process invites group members to explore their life stories through the arts. whether that's life story theatre, life story choirs, life story comics, moving from witnessing within a group, a creative group, to co-creating arts projects where the group share their stories, their lived experiences with audiences, the wider community. So today, I'm going to talk about a life story comic we co-created with a group of military veterans. But before I do, I just wanted to give a little shout back to our original comics creators, and our ancient need, I think, our deep need as human beings to explore our experiences and our environment through the arts. So I think, has everyone got a copy of the comic? Just wanted to check. Because we will be sort of connecting to different parts of it, so you're very welcome to look at it as we go through over the next 15 minutes. So the comic started out coming home as a weekly life story group for veterans who are interested in exploring their own mental health. So the group shared their love of the comics medium, often stretching back to childhood, as well as a need for sharing experiences to raise awareness of the complex issues facing ex-servicemen and women. I invited filmmaker and comics expert Steve Sullivan, who's in the audience, to join the group as our co-editor to begin the process of adapting the group's life stories into comics. So this is the first story in the comic, Safe Haven. It's by a Royal Marine called Robbie, illustrated by Keith Page. Robbie wanted to share a story about a mission to northern Iraq to help a community of Kurdish people who were driven into the mountains by the Iraqi army. And the story is about the deep connection that was made between Robbie and one of the Kurdish families, and how a sudden order to leave the Kurds to their own fate at the hands of the Iraqi army had a profound effect on Robbie's mental health. And we'll go deeper into the impact of moral injury or moral distress a bit later on. Another story in the comic is Hard Shoulder, based on the experiences of a veteran called Dave, illustrated by Clarke Bint. Dave loved his life in the military. It was his home and his identity for 30 years. And his story is about the difficult transition from the military to the civilian world and the cultural conflict he experienced. This is a double-page spread from the story A Healthy Fighting Force, shared by Claire, illustrated by Emma Vicelli. Claire's is a story of our time, detailing the institutionalized misogyny and abuse that she experienced as a normal part of her working life in the military, and the devastating impact on her mental health. I would like to thank Claire for her courage in sharing her story to raise awareness of military sexual trauma and the need for urgent, radical institutional change. This is Stretcher Bearer Stan, set in Northern Ireland in 1974 at the Long Kesh internment camp, and tells the story of a young army musician's experiences trying to process the rights and wrongs of the British military's involvement. The story is about one night when the camp descends into a catastrophic riot, and he is left with the dilemma of whether to medically help his enemies, which he does. The story follows Stan's attempts to process his traumatic experiences in later life and the moral injury that he was left with. The character Stan, that Stan there, is represented like, I don't know if anyone remembers the Bash Street Kids from the Beano, while the internment camp is drawn as a more realistic, tough military world. Artist Mike Donaldson was able to bring to life a visual hybrid of two graphic styles to create a sense of Stan being a fish out of water. I don't think I need to say anything about that. Moral injury is defined as emotional and psychological distress caused by perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs. It is often exacerbated by a sense of betrayal by someone in a position of authority. And at this point, I would like to invite Graham, Stan, to the stage to share a little bit about the creative process and the impact, and maybe just briefly connect to what moral injury means to him. So, welcome, Graham. Thanks, Graham. So I just wondered I know there's lots we could talk about, and the comics making process, by the way, was done all online during the pandemic. So I didn't see a 360-degree version of Graham until way after we'd finished the comic. So it was quite amazing the first time we actually met, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Discovered how tall everybody was, and just those nuances of when you're talking different habits. So, yeah, it's great.
So I just wondered whether you could just share with us just a little bit about what was the comic making process like for you, Graham?
Well, one word would be extraordinary. Another word is enabled me to move on from my nearly 50 years since the event. For 30 years, I hid it completely. I've been in counselling therapy for well over 10 years, and I've tried all sorts of clinical methods to try and heal myself. I've even volunteered to go on clinical trials at university because I just wanted to get better. It resulted, the traumas, what I later discovered was something called moral injury, seemed to be holding me back from everything that was on offer.
Okay.
So I heard about Relive through my counsellor because she'd read an article in one of the professional journals. She gave it to me. She said, read this. This is what you've been talking about. So I joined Relive, and Karen actually had heard the word moral injury, and she knew I could talk to her about it. So the process was validation of a story that I had told in clinical situations, but I'd never been able to share with other veterans, and I'd never gone into my memory and detailed sort of almost minute by minute over 2 days. And it wasn't just that linear, what happened first, what happened last, but Karen was really good at trying to get me to think about what emotions I might have gone through nearly 50 years ago, and trying to understand how I'd felt, why I reacted in certain ways, has been very much a healing process.
So it's like stay. the story was quite fragmented when we started, wasn't it? There were elements, there were moments, there were images you had. And the comics process was just an invitation to start to think in panels and connect things up. I wonder what it was like when we were happy with maybe the first draft of the script and Mike, the artist, came back with maybe his first version of what it might look like. What was that like for you to start to see it outside of yourself?
Well, it was tremendous satisfaction and excitement.
Yeah.
Because we did all this online, and it was a process that really took a year. But I'd never met Mike, because it was working with Karen and with Steve. We did our own storyboards. And Steve would then talk to Mike, the illustrator, and he would come back with his storyboard, which we could then tweak.
Yeah.
But what Mike was genius at, and I'm sure Steve was part of this, was understanding the subtext, because the comic format doesn't actually allow you to write very many words. So you're relying on that creative visual process of filling in the gaps, or more importantly, it's not just gaps, but that subtext, so the reader actually becomes involved in the process themselves. Because, like you said, we're all born with, or I think you mentioned the word imagination at the beginning.
Yeah.
The reader is also brought into this process. So seeing the storyboards, Mike's artwork evolving, and then actually meeting Mike back in October was just such a wonderful kind of brotherly sense that, that this comic process has given to me.
Yeah, like we've built a new creative community, which is amazing because none of us knew each other before this comic. And what was it like, as you said once to me, that the story is now something about being outside yourself for the first time, like you weren't holding onto it. I just wondered if you could share something about that.
For those of you who've sort of suffered some form of traumas, or which I'm sure probably everyone in this room has, you're actually inside the story, looking out. The story is you. But once I saw people up in the Lake District where we launched it, picking up a copy of the comic, reading it, taking it away, and then perhaps even asking questions. That, to me, was Stretcher Bearer Stan. He's now on his own. He's gone off. That never happened during counselling. Even if I talked to people, military counsellors, that never happened. It happened because the audience is out there, and now Stretcher Bearer Stan has left me. I feel healed. Who knows how it's going to affect me the next months, years. But for now, I feel as I'm looking in a totally different place at that story that I'd hidden and lived with for so many years.
Wow. Wait, one more question. Amazing. Amazing. So just one more question, which is, what have been some of the physiological changes that you've noticed over the last year since the comic has been published? Just come forward a bit.
Well, one of the apparent signs, and I knew I was cracking up, was my professional life was as a photographer and as a cameraman. And a director I was working with was in my farmhouse kitchen one day, and we'd been looking at new locations. And he took me aside and he said, "What the hell is wrong with you?" Because I physically shake. I get tremors. You all have heard of First World War tremors. It's not imagination. They are real. Now, largely, I could look at histories in Northern Ireland, and I would become so emotionally involved, I would shake with tremors. I didn't shake this morning when you gave your address. That is one sign. Another sign, which a Jungian counsellor I said to him, after we'd been up to the lakes, I said, I've had a rash on my chest, which comes and goes. I've had it for well over 30 years, and the GP said it's a sweat rash. I said, it's gone. It's a month now, and I haven't had the rash. And so he took a book off his shelf by a lady called Anne Maguire, who's a dermatologist, but she's also a Jungian therapist. And in that book, she explains how psychosomatically can come out into the body, and one of her case studies was of a rash. So Ludwig, the counsellor, said, read that, and that will explain why your rash has gone away. And thankfully, we're not quite 6 months in yet, but I haven't had the rash. I can't explain that. I don't know if any of you can. Reading the book makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you so much. So thank you, Graham. Thank you for sharing some of your experiences there. This is Dave and Graham at the Lakes Comic Arts Festival, which Graham was just talking about. And it was an amazing experience for the group to connect to the comics community and to have those conversations with a new community, which was an amazing experience for all of us. Coming Home, the comic is stopped in comic shops around the world now, in libraries, which I think is amazing. And 80 copies have been sent to a prison in North Wales, which has a very large population of military veterans. And the feedback has been very positive, and prison staff have requested life story training. So they are looking into how to connect life stories to people who are in prison. The comics process is a powerful way of processing trauma. And by activating the parasympathetic nervous system, the person is supported, so is self-regulating, whilst revisiting painful memories. So this allows for exploration. It allows for containment and creativity for healing to take place. So that's amazing about the arts. It's our buffer. It's our way for the brain to be supported, our hearts to be supported, whilst we're revisiting something which we just can't get past. So for me, the arts can support brain health and build new communities and heal communities. The arts can reveal new perspectives on past experiences that help us shape new stories about ourselves and the world around us. So we are in the early stages of creating in Wales, it's the first time I've said it in public, the first dedicated centre in the world for life story arts, a place where co-created arts practice and research are driven by the belief, our belief, that everyone has a story to tell and everyone has a right to tell their story. So we look forward to conversations over the next few days. We're not going anywhere, we, Graham? And Steve's here as well. Give a little wave, Steve, who's done amazingly on that comic. So thank you, everyone, for your time, and hope you have had a look at the exhibition. Oh, and tonight, sorry, last thing to say is looking forward to seeing Cynthia Stone's film, which is amazing, and relives practice a part of that film. So we're really honoured and moved that we can contribute to the dementia, creativity in dementia. So thank you, everyone. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Graham, as well. That's just extraordinary to be able to hear from you both discussing that in tandem. So I'm sure that this raises ideas and questions you'd like to hear more about, so save that for the last half hour. So far, we're keeping to time, so I'll keep us going. Our next speaker is Rachel Clarke-Hughes, who is Head of Engagement at the Playhouse in Derry, Londonderry. Rachel is at the core of the creative engine at the Playhouse, championing the connection between producing art, making peaceful change, and empowering people. So a warm welcome, please, for Rachel.
Oh, wow, Karen and Graham, you did me a massive favour there because I forgot myself, so I'm no longer nervous. Just because the work you've done is so transformative. It's actually taken transformation this morning, so thank you. So a little bit about who I am. Hopefully my slides will come in. I'm Rachel Clarke-Hughes. I go by she, her, hers. And I'm 33, so you could say that I'm one of the peace babies. So thinking about this morning earlier, I was just a little girl in school whenever the Good Friday Agreement came into play. I also happened to go to schools the whole way through that were of the 5%, the integrated or non-denominational, versus the 95% that are still segregated today in Northern Ireland. So that has hugely impacted the course of my life. It has meant that I have had robust, very rigorous creative arts training in collaboration with people of difference, but they were no different to me because I knew no different. I just knew that we had shared vision together in the arts and that we were learning together and training together. And this has sent me on to the point of senior leadership at Covent Garden at the Royal Opera House, to becoming a senior manager at the Playhouse in Derry, Londonderry, to being here with folks like yourselves. So it just goes to show not just that the arts can, but the arts have, but it's now time to scale up and to think differently. For those who are online or perhaps who can't see me, I am a white woman. I've got curly red auburn hair that's been assaulted by a very, very powerful hotel hairdryer. And I'm built for comfort, shall we say, not speed. But I stand before you on the broad shoulders of very hopeful people, most particularly of those, my parents. So, the Playhouse, who I'm here to tell you about, was founded by Pauline Ross, established in 1992. The Playhouse is one of the most vibrant and loved arts organisations in Northern Ireland, based in the city of Derry, Londonderry, in Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland, whatever your preference. And we focus our efforts, like Nick said, on 3 independent key areas: empowering people, producing art, and making peaceful change. And of course, I want to tell you about all of those things, but it would take me 3 hours, not 15 to 20 minutes, so I have to horse on. It's making peaceful change I'm going to talk to you about, and we're focusing on programs in particularly that are working with victims/survivors of the Troubles, but we do an awful lot with young people. That's just more in the empowering people sphere, but if you want to learn more about that, I would love to talk to you about it. The organisation has been doing this transformational work for 30 years now, so you can imagine how delighted I was to join them just over a year ago. And here are some of the very lovely things that people have said about the work that we do. So Theatre of Witness is one of the programmes we're best known for. It's been running for about 13 years, and it was established by artist Tea Stepanuk. And she's created this form where significant life experiences could be shared on the stage, so presenting true narratives to one another. And it was by bringing groups of difference together. It also created a forum for audiences to bear witness. So, we've all heard of empathy as walking in somebody else's shoes, but actually it's the next level, that empathy is believing someone when they say that the trauma has impacted their inner world the way that it has, and not to debate about it, but to purely accept it, hold space for it, and react to it, relate to it. From 2009 to 2014, Tea was the artist in residence at the Playhouse, and she created 4 productions with 30 individuals who had come from being public during the Troubles. They're perhaps ex-paramilitary, perhaps services, or adults from the next generation. It was funded by an EU Peace Grant, and these 30 performers went on with these 4 productions to perform each one a minimum of 14 times in Northern Ireland and in the border areas. And so that really cracked open a lot of people coming forward and saying, we need and want to hear more. So people started to approach the performers from these productions and say, we need you to come out into our community and talk about the process that you've went through and show us how to do it, because we are starting to see the transformation you're undergoing and we want to be a part of that transformation. And here I've got behind me 2 colleagues, James and Anne, from the original Theatre Witness, who I'm still working with today doing this work. And it's a short video, and I'm hoping the gentleman at the back will be able to help play it so you can hear the work in their own words. Oh. I heard a deep sigh there. So as a facilitator, can I just ask everybody just to take one really big deep breath while we get this sorted? Come on. Hold it in at the top. And release it all out. Take this moment to have a bit of mindfulness, you know. I don't claim to be someone who's particularly technical, so, you know, these gentlemen are doing things that I don't think many of the rest of us can do. And as they start fixing that, I'm just going to keep talking along in the presentation to mind our time, because I'm conscious that we've got so much to get through. So Anne and James there are 2 individuals from, I suppose one could say, opposing sides. They're both ex-combatants. James was a member of the UDR, or the UDA, and was imprisoned at Longkesh. And Anne is a former member of the IRA. And they are firm friends and delight in each other. And they have both devoted their lives now to creative peace building and showing others how, through an inclusive, trauma-informed creative pedagogy, things can shift and look different within your community. James very bravely, and his own words, not mine, described himself to Senator John Lewis, civil rights activist, as a former terrorist. He said at the time he calls himself that because the community he felt that he was fighting for, the PUL community, the Protestant Unionist Loyalist community, they would not agree that he was an ex-combatant, because the organisation he was involved in at the time had such a negative impact on their lives as much as the other side. Gentlemen, what do we think about this video? Is it going to happen? Yeah. No? That's grand. So, no worries. It's available on our website, and I would really, really love it if you would look it out, because it's much more impactful to hear from their words and their own voices about how friendship and relationship really transforms things. It was interesting to hear from Graham as a photographer. One could argue that's creative art, but then we don't hurt alone. We don't experience this life alone. So as much as one can self-heal, community healing is an essential part of the process. We don't hurt alone, so we must heal together. And I think, you know, that's something that people forget about ourselves. We think we can do everything alone, but of course we cannot. So if I move along our slides, the ripple effect. So, through all adversity brings new life. Well, during COVID, came a stop to our Theatre of Witness workshops and being able to get out into the ground. We did as many as we could online and digitally, and we actually brought Taya back to explore that. And it was during one of these programs of workshops with Taya that we realised now is the opportunity to write a book. Pauline, the founder of the Playhouse, had retired. We had welcomed a new CEO, Kevin Murphy, to our organisation. It was so it was the timely moment to really reflect on the impact 13 years of this journey has had on the individuals. And so we are the Ripple Effect is literally hot off the press. We have our second book launch tomorrow, which is why I'm hurrying up the road in Belfast. But it covers 11 individual stories from day one of Theatre of Witness to now, 13 years later, and the impact it's had on their lives and in their communities and within their families. So, plug. But if you really want to hear true narratives and the voices of those who experience them, check the book out. It's a very, very powerful read. The other side of the work that we were doing was developing leaders. We started this process where we thought, who are going to be the next generation? We had this cohort of 11 from the original 30 of Theatre of Witness who were so passionately delivering this work, but we want to scale up. We see the scale of the challenge, so we want to find the next cohort. How can we support them? We had anticipated 8 people would sign up. Almost 50 signed up, which just goes to show that their appetite out there to deliver this work is very high and that people do want change, which I think is a very, very hopeful stat. And this is now evolving towards looking at a Leaders for Peace network and bringing people cross-discipline together, because it's through a cross-discipline approach that we're really going to make a difference. We tend to look at the monolith, we tend to look at the single identity because our lovely brains like to keep things simple and seek resolution. But of course, everything is interdependent, not just our 3 core ambitions: mental health, human rights, etc. It's all attached to one another. And so we need to think of a multiplicity of truth and a multiplicity approach to moving us forward. So, change at a time of crisis. We experience COVID. We're in the middle of a climate emergency. The cost of living is extremely high. We've had huge global movements such as Me Too and Black Lives Matter. Our government is regularly in a state of stasis or in flux. And the last 5 years alone, we've had 7 Secretaries of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. And the fundraising landscape is incredibly challenging throughout this. You can imagine how little people wanted to invest when we were going through COVID and dealing with those repercussions still. And that makes for a challenging environment to create sustainable programs that's going to eventually lead to systemic change. And that's why we need to get out and talk to each one another like we're doing today, and to make that difference that we want to do. So what does making peaceful change look like? So Theatre of Witness, as we said, we've cultivated and finessed a trauma-informed creative pedagogy, but should it sit purely squarely within the issue of conflict and sectarianism? Well, we don't think so, given the interdependencies of all of these other huge range of issues. And so we're looking at building programs that address these things, but are also co-designed more and more with the communities they're for, and less sort of prescribed. So that's powerful, is what Theatre of Witness as we know it will become. And it will not just feature sectarianism and post-conflict peace and reconciliation. It will also look at other topics: human rights, migrant and displaced rights, equality, diversity and inclusion, human rights, classism, which is a major issue that is so interdependent with conflict, but was rarely spoken in the same session, which seems to be such a shame to me. Disability, LGBTQ+ rights. So that's powerful, but offer these topics to organisations. They choose the topic. And through 4 modules where we're looking at testimonial and discussion, mindset and relationships, building common ground, hope and resilience, through those, together with the participants, we will determine what the creative capital looks like. With, of course, artists, citizen artists who care about this work, so that whether it's a big dip for you to do a poem with your class, or whether you're ready as a community to take on a full-scale production and tour it, you're involved in those decisions, because we are a community together when we explore those programs of work. with one another. The Youth for Peace Network I've touched on. It seems really more important than ever, given how siloed we've been, to connect as much as we can. Artitude is our climate action programme, and it is deeply impacted by all of these other areas and other topics. You know, it's very difficult to say to somebody in an interface area dealing with conflict and in a working class income that you should not purchase things at Primark, and make them feel more shame about that whenever they're already dealing with so much. So it's about bringing together with communities a positive response to climate crisis that's relevant and meaningful to them. Empowering citizen artists, I'm sure you can touch on it, but it's thinking about the artist consciousness and how we create inclusively and less elitistly. And then producing art, the art that we make, what stories we tell and how we tell them, and the process as well as the product. I've got an example here of Operation Desperation, which is one that we're working on, which is looking at the story of Women's Aid in the north, or in Northern Ireland, during the time of the conflict, a story that rarely gets told, but how women of all persuasions came together to support one another. And we're looking at a whole process where we're capturing narrative with a whole female team, a whole female stage team, really looking at those qualities of Women's Aid and championing them to then take a production on the road. And then what are we ultimately trying to achieve at the Playhouse? We mean to create community, to celebrate diversity and empower people through the arts. That sounds really simple and it sounds really generic, but, you know, hard. It's very hard. And it takes everybody, and it doesn't just don't leave it to the artists. That's another thing that I will say. Don't just leave it to us, guys. Everybody, every human, like Karen said so eloquently, is capable of making art. And whether you realize it or not, you're healing yourself through the art. How quickly did we come together during the pandemic to share information? And how much did those television programs and films and radio and music and literature mean to you back then? Whether consciously or unconsciously, you're going through a collective trauma experience and you meant to use those tools to heal yourselves. So anybody can be a citizen artist. And the difference that we make, people are making meaning together creatively, peacefully, and with hope. And I feel like I have been very, very privileged to have had the education that I have had and the upbringing that I've had to say that that is already happening and can happen at a larger scale. But it takes movements of people. And I hope that Creative Brain Week can contribute to that very global movement. So that's everything from me. I want to say thank yous. I want to say a very big thank you to Dominic for taking a risk, and inviting the Playhouse along, to B, to Eamon, who's taken very good care of us, to my fellow panelists, Nick, our chair, and the gentleman at the back. I want an extra loud round of applause for them, because when things go wrong, we go high, we don't sigh. So join me in giving everybody a big round of applause and a thank you for doing their best. Big step.
Fantastic, Rachel. Thank you so much, and for bringing that wonderful spirit to all of the world of theater production and public speaking. Much appreciated. Your facilitation background shows. So our third speaker, before we break out into a kind of roundtable Q&A session, will be David Cotterrell, artist and director of the Research Institute at Sheffield Hallam University. He's an installation artist working across media and technology to explore the social and political tendencies of a world at once shared and divided. His practice is typified by an interest in intersection, whether fleeing encounter or heavily orchestrated events. Cotterell's work has been commissioned and shown extensively in Europe, the United States, and Asia. He is research professor of fine art and director of Research Institute at Sheffield Hallam, and is represented by the Daniel Arnaud Gallery. A warm welcome, please, for David.
Thank you. Oh. Gosh, there's quite a lot to follow, isn't it? Thank you for the other presentations. They're really inspiring. I'm going to be talking about a slightly different role for the artists, I think. it comes from, well, it's a bit of a journey that started in Dublin about 8 years ago. I'm not going to give you details of the whole 8 years, but I'm going to just touch on a few points. Not so long ago, I had to speak at an all-party parliamentary group in the UK. And it was interesting because I did a painting degree, and it's not really where you expect to find yourself. It was an all-party parliamentary group looking at radicalisation and violent extremism, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. And the irony was that I hadn't really been spending much time in North Africa. But I've been brought in because they were aware that I had worked in some complex landscapes, and they felt there might be some transferable knowledge. In fact, the Lords and the MPs that were there were hoping really for proposals for how you build consent, how the arts could be used to mitigate for inequalities and problems in the world, to try and build a safer landscape for Britain to act and engage. They were looking for people like me to come forward and propose education programs to work in Tunisia to help young people not turn to ISIS, or to look at ways in which we could run development programs to run festivals of football in Palestine, or other kinds of things, which were all extraordinary projects that were happening. But I was there rather cantankerously to suggest that the arts were there to explain to them what they were doing wrong in those parts of the world. It didn't go well, but I spent time trying to explain to them that my role as an artist had allowed me to see some of the ways in which we, maybe despite benign intent, demonstrate lack of trust, overt hostility, contempt even, for people in landscapes where we have disproportionate influence and power, and how sometimes it's possible only when you step outside of the bubble of your own privilege and your own world to look back and realize how we appear to others, and how we might actually be creating some of the conflict that we are despairing about in the world. My engagement with conflict had been unexpected, and this I'm just very briefly going to mention this, but it's important because it sort of contextualizes me and helps explain how I moved from public art in the UK and engaging in community projects there to suddenly being obsessed by international foreign policy of my own government. I was appointed as a war artist to Afghanistan in 2007. I've been working in Holland, and I got a phone call saying, "Would you like to go?" And I had to write back with an ethical statement to decide whether, as a pacifist brought up as a Marxist, it was possible for me to accompany British forces in a foreign conflict that I'd been on the march to protest about. I went because I felt it would be impossible for me to be able to get involved in aggressive political debate about war if given the chance to be present. I'd refused because I wouldn't be able to test my own assumptions. So I travelled with 201 Field Hospital into Afghanistan. I went forward with 40 Commando. I got stranded in Sangin and spent time there, gradually realizing how little I understood about war from all of the films and all of the culture that I'd grown up with in the UK, which obsessively in the 70s and 80s was training people like me to understand or believe that we understood war. It's a big part of the culture of England. When I got there, I realized that the representation, whether it was from Vietnam or from the Second World War, none of it had prepared me emotionally for the absolute horror of what I was looking at. And it wasn't that it was more bloody or more violent, it was that it made no sense. There was no big strategic narrative. There was no beginning, middle, and end. It was simply random moments of violence and unexplained effects on young people's bodies that would carry through for the rest of their lives. A lot of unreconcilable narratives and problems that you might be able to see people addressing initially at that moment, but where they have no understanding of what that would mean in 10 or 20 years' time, either for the landscape they're acting in or for the participants that would be returning back to the UK. I came to believe that what I was looking at was something which was to do with a complete empathetic failure, kind of bemused by the fact that people could deliberately try and inflict pain on each other to this level. It's so obvious, but it's still a shock when you see it and you realize that something has been done deliberately. You think that's only possible through a complete, profound collapse of empathy for you to actually want to inflict harm on another person and not recognize that you might be able to relate to that pain. I made some artwork about it, and I produced some work in London. I will mention this right at the end a little bit. There were some legacy effects that were really important. But this story is about what happened after I came to Dublin. So 2015, I was standing in the Abbey Theatre here talking about that war. And I was trying, after a few years, to think how I might re-engage with some of that landscape. I put to bed some of the issues about the ethical dilemma between war and medicine, how it's possible for people to sign the Hippocratic Oath and the Army Code, be involved in saving lives while also carrying a weapon, and all of those other things that I had to make work about, because that was my remit. But there were other things which were gnawing away at me. And while I was in Dublin, talking about Afghanistan, I thought probably for the last time, my visa came through to go to Pakistan. The reason why I wanted to go to Pakistan was because I wanted to go back to that landscape. But I didn't want to go to the sensationalized, overtly press-covered kind of horror of Pakistan. I wanted to go to to Afghanistan. I wanted to go to something which represented the same global forces and something of the same structural failure in the way in which my country was engaging in the region, but possibly without the tabloid press being interested. Pakistan is interesting because, like Afghanistan, it was receipt of a vast amount of aid. That's figures in dollars, but it's the UK government's investment at that point. It related to things I'd seen in Afghanistan, which was not necessarily the war, but I went back as a tourist straight afterwards to try and make sense of what I'd seen in the military bubble. And I'd seen the failure of international efforts to engage politically, as well as some of the military activity. It wasn't just my own government. I saw chemical factories built by the Russians. I saw schools built by the Taliban. I saw British attempts to sponsor Olympic venues and a whole range of other failed attempts to put a badge on something in a country to show you cared, but leaving things which were simply monuments to failure. When I went to Pakistan, I was trying to understand how it was possible that all of this could be happening, all this investment, this care, this belief, this desire to make a change, and yet they were getting it so wrong. And part of it was because when I arrived in Pakistan, I managed to it was a bit tricky in 2015. It was still seen as a high-risk country for Britain, and so I got the British Council to give me a security pass so I could go into the diplomatic enclave, and we came up with a risk assessment, which meant I didn't have to resign from my university job. And I landed there, and I was following a British Council kind of itinerary, which involved going straight to the safe house here, with armed guards being pushed in there. They locked the doors behind me, and they said, "We'll come and pick you up in the morning." And of course, I was scared. And what I was realizing was that I had no knowledge of the threat beyond the walls, because I was not actually going to be allowed within the itinerary to witness what was going on beyond the walls. So after they'd gone, I got changed and went walking and kind of actually stepped outside. But I managed, because as an artist, nobody knew what my role was, and I'm quite low value. If I'd been a diplomat, it would have been different. If I'd worked for the Foreign Commonwealth Office, there's no way it could have happened. And even if I ran the South Bank Centre as the person who came after me, they probably wouldn't be allowed to leave the armoured car either. But as an artist, it was possible for me to have a security pass to be in the diplomatic enclave, and also to wander freely along the streets and kind of begin to test whether the risk and the fear and the threat was real. It might be a bit foolhardy, but in fact, what I encountered was kindness, of course. Complexity, problems, generosity, and humanity. The British Council office was here. That was behind 6 kilometres of razor wire, so it's very hard for them to interact directly with the public. And when they did go out, they were out in armoured cars like this, rather than the streets like this. It was transformative for me, because as I left Dublin, went to Pakistan, I realized that what I was trying to do was to understand what role an artist can have, what is justifiable for somebody like me. There is an extraordinary kind of amount of work that's done through the arts to facilitate and to bring people together and to enable dialogue and to help with mitigating for some of the effects of international policy, to look at how you rebuild lives after conflict, how you actually allow communities to come together. And we've heard about some of that here. But I'm not a facilitator, and I wasn't that person. I couldn't do that. But I did feel there was a need also for an additional role, which was that of the independent subjective witness. Somehow to be present, to be uncensored, to be able to get access, and not make a judgment about the country you're looking at, but look back at your own country from that place and begin to question what it is you've been told already, how you've been conditioned, and how you can maybe go back and challenge the assumptions. So I started going more regularly. I went as a historian to go to present for one visa, and as an architect for another. I made films, and I learnt some Urdu, and I spent some time with local communities, and I began to try and find a way to both confront the prejudice that was built up through the received information I had before, but also to begin to find agency as an artist making artwork, but also recognizing that I was learning something about myself by being there that wasn't in the artwork, but was going to change the way I responded to the landscape back home. Beyond that, there was more that had to be done, and I started to, with people I'd met in the conference in Dublin, I started to make links with other like-minded people, theatre makers, visual artists, performers, dancers, and all of us started recognizing that what we were aspiring to be was the outsiders within our own community, where we are participants and we're complicit in the societies we're part of, but also somehow we're trying to claim that space where we can have a third-person view looking at ourselves and look at the strange anomalies of capitalism, but while also being in the capitalist world, while recognizing something about the strangeness of the hierarchies of passports while still having a passport. And we realized we could do that more effectively through partnership. So working in partnership with an artist from Sri Lanka, she was able to kind of begin to challenge her perspectives as an outsider of Sri Lanka through my ignorance and understanding from a distance, and I was beginning to understand something about the way that I would be perceived from South Asia. We started finding networks of people in Rwanda, in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, and other places, and began to form platforms for equitable challenge, where we would contradict and complain about each other's understandings, but also begin to make our own understandings more pluralistic. In Rwanda, we worked on combinations of producing plays, while also making visual arts projects that would intervene with museums, working in collaboration with a Rwandan theatre director, Rwandan artists, myself, and Sri Lankan theatre groups to bring things where we were expected to bring a play, but we decided we would also make non-linear artworks that would challenge the curatorial authority of the museum and begin also to step outside of our own territory and claim the right to host debates. We brought in the American ambassador, we brought in the DFID representative, the Department for International Development, alongside the blogger from Burundi and the Afghan filmmaker, and started kind of hosting events where we would talk about guilt or legacy. Well, they might be assuming that we were talking about the Hutus and Tutsis, but we weren't. We were talking about the American ambassador's institutional guilt or other kinds of issues. And we were trying to make sure that these platforms, everybody had the same, it didn't matter their background or their income or their passport, everybody had the same right to raise a question of each other. We moved on from that to being quite audacious and beginning to try and convene. And this was interesting because from the micro attempts of trying to host platforms that were multidisciplinary to challenge the authority of one discipline to provide strategic analysis, we also kind of started kind of actually co-hosting events. So in this one, we co-hosted the World Conference on Statelessness, which is not necessarily conflict, but it's one of those upstream factors and possibly one of the symptoms of conflict, with a group that you would expect to be doing it, that were constitutional lawyers, with 70 UN people talking about the rights of their child, but we also brought 150 artists across, and we intervened not only by putting artists on the platforms to do things in between sessions, but actually making sure that they were doing keynote addresses. But by planting performance artists in audiences, by taking over the security system for the conference, and making sure that a diplomatic passport meant you had to wait longer in the queue than having no passport. It was a kind of an attempt to try and look at the structure as well as simply pretend the structure is neutral while talking about an important issue. And somehow try and build in the idea that you have to begin to challenge your own sense of identity and empathize with others if you're going to try and produce policy which in any way affects other people's lives. It was a fascinating and extraordinary process. But we have to win the argument every time. There is an understanding that it's important to look at these sustainable development goals. Some of them are seen as the causes of conflict, and some of them are caused by conflict. There is a global coalition of really decent people and organizations trying to do things. But there are some structural problems which mean that people aren't always necessarily producing more good than harm. There is a problem to do with our risk and our fear of risk and our recognition of our own value and how important we are, which means that this risk matrix is rather silly, but this is about what you normally have is to do with the likelihood of risk and the severity if it happens. What I was talking about here was the distance achieved, which is a way of mitigating for risk. Very hard to get hurt if you're offshore using surveillance. The risk of that correlated with the risk of empathetic failure or complete disengagement and a lack of understanding of what you're looking at. There are structural problems with the way that powerful countries engage with other countries. The scale of view is something which is fundamentally kind of built into the standard conventional methodologies of the way in which governments engage. It's to do with the fact that as you become more powerful and you develop more of a macro perspective, you can only analyze a certain amount of summative data. You're looking at trend analysis. If you're becoming powerful enough to have huge impact, if you're a donor organization or if you're a foreign power, you're unlikely to still have the agency to actually go and meet people that haven't already been vetted before they come to see you. You're unlikely to be able to step outside of the bubble to see what the impact is beyond the world that you're viewing from your own lens. We have the problem of unknown outcomes where people are measuring their success against hypotheses for what would be a useful thing to do, rather than actually kind of allowing themselves to be challenged by the people they're working with, and maybe even challenge the people that are employing them to say that you're measuring the wrong thing, or maybe the original hypothesis was wrong. The possibility of trusting people to have unknown outcomes, where the inquiry is the thing that you value, and the outcome is something which you allow to evolve. The feedback loop from ground level to government is something which is why I was in that all-party parliamentary group. Although I had the British passport and I had all of the power to travel back home in a way that it was possible for me to be able to explain to them how they would never understand what it was like to have a PhD waiting in the other side of the British consulate office in Islamabad for 3 or 4 days, hoping to maybe get seen to have permission to come over to Britain. And instead, they were kind of wondering why their policies of funding major projects in Islamabad weren't making people love them. It was not being able to actually get the people that are experiencing the first-person view to confront the people that are creating the strategic plans and trying to make sense of a macro perspective. Artists are not necessarily good at this, but we do aspire to trying to... Empathy is our currency. It's what theatre and art and music and dance is about. It's about trying to engage with an audience to the point where, in the simplest way, somebody else is witnessing our dream so that we don't feel alone as artists. It's what we try and do. Seeing ourselves in the way that other people see us is something which we have the liberty to wrestle with, and it's something which possibly is not easy to achieve. I've only got a few seconds, but I just want to mention 1 or 2 things that are hopeful. When I finished my time in Afghanistan, and I went straight back to teaching because I felt guilty about missing the dissertation deadline, and I went to meet all of the soldiers that I'd seen injured, and I tried to get over my guilt for coming back not being injured. Years later, it was possible, because of the university system, for somebody to care about the narratives and the outcomes which I couldn't possibly have expected. I knew that I was going to have an exhibition in a year's time. I knew that I was going to get trained and that I would try and make sense of what I saw with some kind of ethical view, but I had no idea that we would change the censorship rules for the Ministry of Defence, which meant that journalists could then view British wounded in future. I didn't know that by seeing all the patients and by having the freedom of being an artist and demanding that, it was possible for soldiers to have access to their patient records in future. And these things were also not really the things which we could put into the exhibition. But because there was an academic frame which looked at impact over a 20-year period, it was possible to recognize that some of the most important outcomes were things which we couldn't possibly have predicted, but we had to actually just trust that by allowing people agency to follow an inquiry, it was possible to yield results which might be more important than their original intention. I am over time, and so I will simply say this. In my view, I think that the arts have more of a role. It doesn't mean that all of the things the arts are doing at the moment are recognized by society as being vital, shouldn't continue. That's absolutely essential. But I believe that the arts have a role to raise questions, to challenge those within authority, as well as being part of the delivery model for trying to make the world a better place. In a way, it's about being cantankerous, difficult, raising questions, recognizing not necessarily that we have a better view, but that by focusing on idiosyncratic, subjective views of the world, it's possible to really reveal something of the failure of the meta-narrative if it doesn't encompass those ideas and those experiences within those perspectives.
Stay up there. Thank you so much, David. Really great to see the scale of the work and the different landscapes across which you've operated. And I think I'll invite all the speakers now to come forward, everyone we heard from. We're going to do a kind of quick roundtable style discussion. We still have a good 20 minutes until our full time is called, which I hope will create sufficient opportunity for us to really draw out some patterns and some threads that are across the three talks, and see in what ways does this resonate with the discussion that we began this morning and with your own concerns here as an audience. So the way the lights are structured in this room, as has been referred to before, I can't actually see the people in the very middle, so I'm going to block with my hand. And I'm going to just ask for a quick show of hand for anyone who'd like to say something over the next 20 minutes. Just a quick show of hands, even if you haven't formed your statement yet. Okay, I'm sensing reluctance. So from that, so we'll get a few voices there, but it helps me to know whether it's heat or cool. So I'm going to start the panelists with a little crosstalk and see if that gets the ball rolling initially. What I would love is to, because I think just listening to you, I see resonances between the different things that you said from very different perspectives and landscapes. And I would really love to hear each speaker in the event that you went, starting with Karen, just for 1 or 2 minutes to respond to the other two talks, so that what you just heard from the others, with your ears, listening from your perspective, what did you particularly notice is going on there that speaks to you or your work? Was there a moment that you'd like to hear more about, or something that you really notice from Rachel's work and from David's work, Karen?
Well, it was amazing to hear from both of you, and obviously Graham as well. I think the arts is one of the routes to community and to connection. And part of the healing of Taya's work and what you're doing at the Playhouse is all about hearing different sides of people's lived experience and finding ways of connecting. You know, we know the the old adage, there is more that unites us than divides us, but trauma does a strange thing for us. And the statistics this morning, I think that Kieran shared about young people experiencing suicidal ideation, we know the impact of trauma through the generations. I only think we're beginning to think about trauma as part of our DNA. Where does it sit? Where do those stories sit in the body? How do they carry across between the generations? And so for me, sharing through the arts is quite a freeing experience, to allow the stories to be heard and witnessed, and to build empathy and compassion, which is that sort of action of empathy, the ability maybe to offer a hand to an enemy, and to actually feel the connection between you as human beings, because essentially that's what we are. And for David, I feel the same, just that it's that, but almost you surprise me a little bit with that agitation and a little bit of that cantankerousness for policy and politics, that the arts can play a part in revealing things for people. And it can be quite an uncomfortable space to have that sort of reflected back on us. But thank you for doing that. Thank you for getting amongst it. We need the artists to reveal these experiences for us, not for us as community so much, even though I know it's important, but for the policymakers, for those politicians who are writing those and signing people off to go to war. We need to stop that. And whilst the statistics is important, having that reflected back, that sort of promotes a visceral, emotional experience, I think. Even politicians are human. And I think that hopefully can help to change things and make a better world that we all want to see. I could go on and on, but I'm going to stop now.
Lovely.
Thank you, both of you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Graham, would you like to also say anything about what you heard? We have a microphone for you here. Just there.
Do you want me to hold it? Are you okay?
Well, I was interested, David, how you, towards the end, about soldiers coming back and being able to tell their life stories. Part of my process, and I read whilst working with Relive on the comic, was some books by Edward Tick, who talks about the indigenous tribes in North America and how their sense of community for their warriors when they come home, that they can story tell. And then the warriors would meet with an older warrior and they would tell their story. So what that tells me is that telling stories, as Karen said with the first slide, is part of our DNA. It's what we are. And that might not be the whole answer to healing, but it's certainly, tell me it doesn't exist, because it does exist. And that's exactly what you're doing in Derry. And I hope I get an opportunity to come and visit you.
Yeah, for sure. I would love Graham and Karen and the whole tribe to come to Derry. Come on.
We're coming.
Well, we're making community. That's what we're doing here.
You're all welcome.
That conversation is coming. Would you like to comment on what else you heard today?
So I guess the thing, there's so many themes to really explore. I felt with Karen and Graham's that the authenticity of hearing the impact directly from the people involved cannot, I wish there were more people with me, because there are an awful lot who could speak with that true authenticity, and that authenticity matters. And when you are authentic in yourself, you don't feel the need to attack somebody else's identity, however they identify, and that is a big theme of the work that we do as well. So that authenticity really came through in your presentation in the morning, and then how vital it is to see one another as humans. We do love neat and tidy structures and hierarchies, but being a human is a messy affair, and requires us to get off our high horses sometimes. So that inclusive approach really shined through. And also what I thought was very, very pertinent was Graham's point that he's tried lots of different things. I think sometimes in our very scarce culture, and also as artists, we're often having to be a bit embattled about saying, the arts really do matter and they really, really do make a difference. It can sometimes seem like we're dismissing other methods or other disciplines, and it's not that at all. It's to say that different things will serve us at different times, and we don't know the medicine that we need, but sometimes the arts can offer that. We can facilitate that space, and it can make a difference. And that's not to say that other methods aren't also worth being championed. And I also loved in David's the theatricality of the rules we impose upon ourselves, like passports and bits and pieces like that. There's so much theatricality in our day-to-day lives. We walk along and we accept, the British queue is always a bit of theatricality, the fact that everybody will form a queue. Well, why are you queuing for? Why have we done these things? And to go into that with a bit of a question in mind, and not having the argument of the arts, but the vitality of the arts, If your dad dies, or your heart gets broken, or you're thrown into unimaginable circumstances, you will seek art, and you will seek to make art. Suddenly poetry matters. The normal, ordinary, I consider myself extraordinary with my rural working class background, Suddenly the arts are absolutely essential to breathe your next breath that day. Or the opposite, you fall in love and you've wondered, has anybody ever felt this? Suddenly you've got a windfall of luck and you want to share it and you want to celebrate it. Ceasefire has been called. Life has changed. And then the arts again become absolutely essential. And we go about it not knowing that we're doing it. But if we were to dial that up in our lives, how transformational that could be.
Lovely. Thank you so much. David, do you want to comment as a respondent on the other two?
Yeah, very briefly, because I just spoke for far too long. But it was just, I think what you said about the stories, for me, is crucial. I think I really struggled to understand what to do with 1,000 photographs and a diary that I'd written. I didn't really have a purpose apart from to observe and to listen to people. And I tried to work out how you justify that purpose. And because it took me so long to find each of the soldiers who was injured, because the Ministry of Defence wasn't helping me, by the time I got to them, I had this question of what do I do with... I was a witness to your treatment. Most of them self-administered morphine. They were brought back delirious to the hospital. They'd have life-saving operations that in previous conflicts they probably would have died from the injury already, and they were waking up in England or in Germany or Cyprus as with a new identity. And I had photographs of that process, and I felt guilty for having them. And I said, should we destroy the photographs? Should we anonymize them? What do you want done with them? But the thing was that by the time I met them, they all felt anonymous. Because time had passed, they were back in society carrying mental or physical scars of an experience which there was no platform for them to share that with anyone. And they felt that society forgot them. And the interesting thing was that the solidarity of people being categorized by uniform only works while you're in uniform.
Yeah.
As soon as you're out of that, you're essentially on your own trying to make sense of life.
Yeah.
And this assumption that a collective narrative is good enough is a really interesting way of society compartmentalizing people and not dealing with the real challenge, the fact of the infinite complexity, which not only would possibly undermine the way a regiment works, possibly at the moment, but it would also make it very difficult for factions and polarization to form at the speed it does. But certainly with soldiers, when they leave and they have to essentially invent their place in society from scratch, often overnight, this radical change that wasn't expected. They're not always given a platform where you say, actually, your story is distinct and important, and you have a right to share it. And that was one of the things we managed to take back. All the soldiers wanted the images used. We made them in a book. That's how we forced the Ministry of Department of Health to allow them, future soldiers, to have images of themselves if they've been injured.
Wow. Fabulous. Thank you so much. So I had one friendly hand here in the middle section who said they might be interested to speak. Would you like to ask a question?
Microphone.
We have a microphone coming to you.
I actually don't have a question right now, but I was very struck by David's presentation. I, in some ways, thought it would be least interesting initially, which already shows your own prejudice because everybody else was about collective experience. But I thought it was fascinating and inspiring, possibly, to us all to kind of question the positions we have in the world when we travel, when we go to other places, and even that idea of putting the diplomats who had their passports at the end of the queue. Like, I thought that was perfect example of how we have to continually question the prejudices we have and the cultural backgrounds that we take for granted.
Thank you so much. Would someone else like to ask a question or raise a point? Yes, down here in front. Thanks. And then I'll take you.
Yes, I mean, thank you. Those were great. Every contribution was great, and I learned a lot from it. And I've seen the Theatre of Witness on a number of occasions. It's a very powerful piece. But my question is for you, Graham. And it is just a direct question. I met an ex-internee, an ex-Republican prisoner, an ex-internee, an ex-Republican prisoner within the last 2 weeks, who was there on the same day that you were there in Long Kesh in 1974. And he was traumatised, he's psychologically traumatised, no doubt about it. But his perspective, and I think the shared perspective of the prisoners, is one of pride. And there's a very prominent mural now on the Falls Road in West Belfast, which actually looks quite like the artwork here in the comic. And the title on it is it's something along the lines of the largest scale confrontation between Republicans and British Crown forces since 1921. I mean, they talk about it with pride. So my question is quite simple, actually. Have you ever met anyone since 1974 who was on the other side, in inverted commas? Or would you like to if you haven't?
The question was, have I spoken to anyone since then?
Who was part of that?
I went back on the 40th anniversary, and around about that time, I'd made contact through Facebook, social media, with some Republicans, and I'd made contact with 2 people from the Bloody Sunday families. And yes, I had made contact, I've spoken to them, and I'm hoping to go back again this year. And overall, the generosity of humans one-to-one has been terrific, which I think is completely echoed. And the work that you're doing in the theatre, yeah, it's a way forward, definitely. There's a certain fear for me when I go to Belfast. But yes, and I think it is the way. We've got to talk.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I believe we have a question or two coming in from online, and I have a representative in the room for the online space who's speaking for them. Yeah.
So just to give voice to those online, there isn't any questions at the moment, but just a couple of comments, so apologies.
That's fine, thanks.
So from Veronica Franklin Gould, she was saying, Karen, what a thoughtful process. It's generous of Graham to share and heartwarming to see the relationship between you and the exercise has restored his identity with pride. Impressive. She goes on to say how amazing to have a co-creative storytelling arts hub in Wales. And we also have a comment from Siobhan Casey saying, great presentation about a phenomenal organisation doing great work in Derry. So just to pass those along, thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you for those warm comments, online commentators. Is there more? Just because I have, maybe I'll take one more before we do a sum up. Yes, please, yeah. Microphone coming.
Oh, sorry.
There you go, thanks.
We're talking about creativity, and I know during the pandemic, the arts were so hard to do, to see, anything. Karen, I wonder if you could tell the story about, I talked to you one time and you were saying that Zoom actually worked in your favor because, well, you tell why. Do you know the story of the man who wasn't getting out of bed, and then you had a Zoom meeting and...
Oh, right,
Can you tell that
gosh.
story? It was really a beautiful way of having this isolating experience, but somehow you made it work to everyone's advantage.
Yeah, well, Zoom, we thought it's a teleconference space. It's a place of meetings. It's not a place of creativity. How can you possibly be creative in Zoom? Well, I was proved wrong, completely wrong, because the comic was co-created on Zoom. And I think the example you're sharing was right back at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was a military veteran. And he had gone into a dorsal collapse. He had completely collapsed. He was gripped by fear that he was in bed in the dark, but he connected to Zoom. So he was just saying, I've shit out my meds. I don't want to be here, but I'm here. Wow. I was like, okay. Because I knew this gentleman and I knew that he connected to music, so I asked him, would he be okay in going into a breakout room with Neil? And he knew Neil, so he said yes. So I took him through how to use that breakout room, and he was focused on the words. Neil and this gentleman went into a breakout room, and within 20 minutes, they were back in the main room where we were doing a creative session. And he was in the light. He was in his kitchen. He'd propped the phone on the worktop. I came right up to the camera and went, I'm going to make a cup of tea. Is that all right? Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I'm a bit hungry now. I'm going to get a banana. Is that all right? Yeah. And so for the next part, he then just joined in the creative session that we were doing. And what had happened in the breakout room, which was extraordinary, is the moment, that's what the healing power of the arts. Through this gentleman loves playing the mouth organ. Neil has a mouth organ. They just played music together for that 20 minutes. And that allowed this man to come out of the collapse into a place of co-regulation, connection with the musician, which then sort of enabled him to come back into the main group and carry on with the session. So the medicine was the music, the medicine was the relationship, the medicine was the connection, and that allows the body to come into that co-regulated space, the shared space that allows us to feel supported, allows us to feel safe, to sometimes revisit painful, traumatic experiences, or to even dream of hopeful futures. But that sort of, they call it the ventral vagal state, if anyone's interested in polyvagal theory. But it really does allow us to feel supported, and that's what happened. So I think that's the story.
Okay. Wonderful. So we're right at time. So I think my best function now as chair is to wrap us up. Very challenging to kind of carry these strands together. But I do want to call attention to just 2 or 3 features before we depart, because we have Imagination tomorrow. We have a great program for the rest of the evening, and then Joy on the final day. So there's kind of an intentional stacking of the day that we're thinking in terms of conflict at the beginning, but we're also kind of dealing with issues of possible through ways, or not necessarily resolution, but ways through. And what I noticed in all of these today is a kind of dialectic movement of art, a movement that pulls in 2 different ways. One is that it's an incredible vehicle for connection. empathy across lines, empathy across difference, community building that helps us to see what's underneath those surfaces and those superficial things that divide us to much deeper elements. And whether we describe those in terms of neuroscience, the systems that we all share, or just our practical experience of music, of art, of togetherness, there is a kind of grouping and a togetherness. But I think something that really came through powerfully for me is the opposite of that as well, that art can provide us with necessary distance. It can create a separation from being in the midst of that fire and that kind of fear of the emotive part of it, to create that sort of therapeutic distance and differentiation and give us the zone from which we can see it outside of ourselves and critique. So that kind of double action is such a fascinating element to this tool of creativity. So as we hear about artists as critics, the role of art to critique, the collaboration, the communication, the community building, the convening, forgive the alliteration, I think we're at a wonderful moment here in kind of Creative Brain Week to think about the diversity of those strands and the ways that that can intervene in such challenging situations. So a really warm thanks to our panelists. Thank you all so much for doing that. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.